So Jack is making a couple comments. Let me read them. He says, the Calvinist argument from John 6:44 is that all those who are drawn will come and be raised. I think everyone are drawn, but may not come and be raised. And then he says, but I struggle with explaining verse 44 and the use of the pronoun. James White argues that the same him who is raised is the one who is drawn and comes. Okay, well then let's take a look at the text. Let's start in John 6, and we'll just keep reading until I think we've reached a point where I would be able to answer that question, okay? And then we'll get back to other questions. This relates also to the body and the blood and the bread and the wine, as you're going to see. This is why I kind of brought this up. But so Jack's question is related to it. It doesn't specifically deal with but we just read about what the significance of the blood and the body are, right? So that should be clear. And we've talked about how it was poured out and given, the body and the blood, for our forgiveness of sins on our behalf. And that they were also for the purpose of the kingdom, the Father's kingdom. So now we are definitely into the territory of the forgiveness of sins, salvation, both in the sense that he specifically mentioned, that is the pouring out of the blood and the giving of his body. And then in relation to the kingdom, which of course you'd have to be cleansed, like even Revelation 7 says, before you could enter it. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get to these texts. John 6. I may just go to the end of the rest of the chapter, but I chose to start this portion of our discussion related to John 6 in verse 35. So I may read all the way to the end of John 6, so prepare. It's not like a super long section, and some of the verses are brief, but focus on what it says and think of Jack's question, and we'll deal with that. Okay, verse 35. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me will not get hungry at all, and he that exercises faith in me will never get thirsty at all. Verse 36, but I have said to you, you have seen me, and yet do not believe. Verse 37, everything the Father gives me will come to me, and the one that comes to me I will by no means drive away. Verse 38, because I have come down from heaven to do not my will, remember I said we'd get to this, but the will of him that sent me. In verse 39, this is the will of him that sent me, that I should lose nothing out of all that he has given me, but that I should resurrect it at the last day. Verse 40, for this is the will of my Father, that everyone that beholds the Son and exercises faith in him should have everlasting life, and I will resurrect him at the last day. Okay, well, Jack, I want to point, let's go back, look at verse 36. Who is he talking to? But I have said to you, you have seen me, and you do not believe. Verse 40 says, everyone that beholds the Son and, we'll just say, has faith in him, will be given everlasting life and be resurrected on the last day. So, okay, Jesus in verse 36 is talking about these people who are seeing him, but they don't have faith in him. And he says in verse 40 that the one he's talking about, that he will give everlasting life to and resurrect on the last day, both beholds him and has faith in him. So he's definitely not talking about anyone who would be involved in verse 36. Can we agree on that? Jack, I want a yes or no on that from you. I know we'll get to the White's and others' views, but give me a yes or no on your view on that, and then we'll get going with the rest of the account, starting in verse 41. But I'd like to know if you agree with me to this point, that verse 40, the one beholding the Son and having faith in him, the one who's given everlasting life and who's resurrected, cannot be anyone included in verse 36. And now, Jack, if you need to think about that, just put that down so I don't wait too long. But I want to stay with this. Maybe I'll take a drink, right? Let's get this. Anyone else can comment too. We'll get to your questions in a minute, Betsy. I see them. And the others. I see G Master. Let me deal with this section here. It's related to our discussion and very important. People do use this. Calvinists do use this a lot, this account. And this account is where Jesus talks about his body and his blood. Of course, not in the way that some here misunderstand him. That's the whole point of what I'm asking. We're going to find that out further. But let me get Jack's thoughts on what I just said. Verse 40 and verse 36. Are those the same people? I say no. I'm gonna say no on that, Jack. Now, maybe later they come to believe, but I'm talking about right now. So I'll give Jack another moment or two here. This is important because, well, if White and others want to bring up pronouns, I mean, you can, as you saw when I read, for example, verse 39. There are pronouns all over this account, but I think contextually we can definitely identify who we're talking about. But that's what I'm trying to point out here, that so far there's no way the people he's talking about in verse 40 would be the people in verse 36. Not to this point, right? I mean, he'd be contradicting himself. So I'll read with the rest of the account. Jack, you think about that. Or if you may not, maybe you had to take a break. So maybe Jack wasn't with us. He'll hear it later though. Okay, verse 41. Now notice, therefore the Jews began to murmur at him because he said, I'm the bread that came down from heaven. He's not really, they didn't murmur at him because of these other things, even though it's significant. But when he said he came down from heaven, they freaked out. Okay, so verse 42. And they began saying, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it that now he says, I have come down from heaven? Verse 43, in answer, Jesus said to them, stop murmuring among yourselves. Verse 44, no man can come to me. This is Jack's major verse here, the main verse. No man can come to me unless the Father, who sent me, draws him. And I will resurrect him in the last day. Okay. So I would say, I'm going to stop right here. And there's another application to a couple texts coming I'm going to make too. I think you guys will enjoy. But let's stay with this subject here. So Jack, now I would say that in verse 44, he's talking about the same people in verse 40, but that he's still not talking about the people who would be included in verse 36. Okay. So now, let me also, he says a little bit briefer. If you look at verse 44, everybody, we really have to ask ourselves a question here. Because in verse 44, it says, no man can come to me unless the Father draws him. Okay, now, is it possible, Jack, that part of verse 44, no man can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, that part is verse 36, people? Jack, what's your answer on that question? James White is getting a big insight right now, by the way. I don't mean that he can't understand the account. I just mean in terms of how we understand it. But that's kind of what I want him to have, if he hasn't gotten it by now. I mean, I know he prefers his own view. But my point is, when I read the text, this is how I go about it. Okay, so Jack, think about that. I think the first part of verse 44 could include people in verse 36 because did they not come to him? Right? They definitely came to him. They're there. So the Father had to draw them according to verse 44. Yet, according to the rest of verse 36, they don't believe. So there's no way they could be included in verse 40 or, Jack, the second part of verse 44. You can be drawn to the Father, but that doesn't mean you're drawn by the Father to the Son. We know that because they're here. But that doesn't mean you're going to be resurrected on the last day because verse 40 says you have to behold the Son and have faith. But verse 36 says they don't have faith. You see what I'm saying? You can be drawn by the Father because these people were drawn by the Father. Are they not here? It says in verse 44, no man can come to me unless the Father draws him. The Father who sent me draws him. Okay? So if that is not true, then we have another problem. If that is true, then there's no way to exclude the verse 36 people from being drawn by the Father. Jack, this is very, very important. I know you know that, but I want to emphasize it. There's no way to exclude the verse 36 people from being drawn by the Father because according to verse 44, no man can come to Jesus unless the Father draws him. But yes, yet verse 36, the second part, and yet you do not believe, proves you can be drawn by the Father and yet not resurrected on the last day, because verse 40 says you have to have faith, which the verse 36 people expressly do not have according to Jesus. And so that's how you understand the second part of verse 44. Yeah, okay, so verse 36 people are drawn. Well, I mean, whether they came to him in belief or not, I wouldn't even get into it. If you choose to, it's up to you. They came to him. That's all we need to know. Because verse 44 doesn't say they believed in him. You see what I'm saying? Verse 44 doesn't say anything about belief. The only way we know the second part of verse 44 requires belief is because of verse 40. That's how we know. And the only way we know that the verse 36 people are not included in the second part of verse 44 or verse 40 is because they don't have faith. And according to verse 40, that is required to get everlasting life and be resurrected on the last day. So the reason why it's written this way, you may be wondering, because he's dealing with people who were drawn but not going to get everlasting life. He says it himself, verse 36, you do not believe, yet the Father has drawn you. You have to have faith. If you don't have faith, you can be drawn by the Father, whether you have faith or not. You can get into that, Jack, but my point is, you can be drawn by the Father. And in fact, these very people had to be drawn by the Father. They wouldn't be here because they're men and they do not believe. Verse 36. So verse 36, verse 40, and verse 44, I think together tell it all. I mean, the rest are part of the account, but you see what I'm saying? All right, now let's get into the rest of the account. I think I'm going to leave that because I think that's it. That's the key. Everything we just discussed and presented, verse 36, verse 40, verse 44, together explain that whole situation involving being drawn and yet being resurrected. Okay, I think that's clear.